Hello everybody. So today we're going to be talking about a little bit of a weird topic, which is, can something be too good for its own good in the course of history? And the example that I want to use here is something like The Shining by Stephen King. The movie The Shining by Stephen King is a well-known classic movie that many people talk about as being one of the greatest movies of all time, and the book of the same title that it's based on is also considered one of the greatest horror novels of all time, also one of Stephen King's greatest books of all time. And here's where I have to make a confession. I've never seen The Shining by Stephen King. I did read the book though, but that's relevant to today's discussion because it brings up a very interesting point. And the way that it relates to this topic is something called cultural osmosis. I don't know if this is a real scientific term or not, but it's one that I have adopted to my own personal vocabulary. And I guess the explanation of the term cultural osmosis would boil down to things that as a culture, they become so unilateral that we absorb them without having to think about it. Certain classic songs on the radio are an example of this. The Star Wars franchise, especially the original trilogy, is an example of this. Essentially, there are things in culture that become so prevalent and they become used as examples or quoted or memed so often that you no longer have to experience the thing personally to know a significant amount about that thing. Every so often, you have a piece of art created that is just so powerful that it changes the landscape of everything that comes after it. And honestly, I think there are many factors that can go into this concept. Weirdly enough, one of the sections at the end of the Brandon Sanderson book, The Way of Kings, actually has a character positing what makes art unique or special. And there's so many factors that can go into it, like when it was released, what the culture was ready for, what it had already seen that might be similar, but this might be twisting tropes on. What we consider revolutionary or influential is heavily dictated by the time and place that it is experienced or is brought to the public. This is one of the reasons that I always thought the movie Yesterday was a strange concept that I don't think actually works. In the movie Yesterday, through a bunch of movie telling shenanigans, a person is essentially put in a parallel universe where they are one of the only people on Earth who remember anything about the band called the Beatles. The Beatles are obviously one of the largest and most influential music artists ever. And while this is a little bit of a side tangent, I think it's weird because the movie posits the question, if someone were to write the Beatles songs and play the Beatles songs now, would they become the cultural phenomenon that the Beatles were when they originally released that music? And due to pop culture generally following trends and sort of being prepped for things by the things they're already absorbing, I honestly think there's no way releasing the Beatles music now, if the Beatles had never existed, would ever be very successful in any mainstream level similar to what they did the first time or the original time. But then you could flip this on its head and say that there is no way we would have a lot of the music that we have now in the way that we have it if the Beatles had never existed. And that's a really interesting thought experiment that sort of goes back into the topic I want to talk about today, which is Stephen King's The Shining. In The Shining, Stephen King writes a story in his traditional stream of consciousness prose style that dives deep into characters and struggles they might be having. It's a really powerful writing style that if you haven't experienced Stephen King for yourself, it's just really cool to see it for the first time or the second time. I really don't know anyone that writes the way that he writes based on what I've read from him. The Shining is a great example of that. It's about an alcoholic dad who's struggling with his family life, who tries to take a deal where he takes care of a hotel way up in the snowy area of the mountains. There's a lot of things that take place, but ultimately ends up being a horror story with a combination of his alcoholism returning, his evil desires manifesting from within himself externally, amplified by the power of this evil magical hotel. There's a little boy who has some sort of extrasensory powers that allow him to experience the thoughts of other people that they're feeling very strongly, and slowly crazy things from the hotel come to life, and they're sort of powered by this evil energy in the main character in The Shining. Even today, it is an enjoyable read, and Stephen King's writing really comes through in a strong way. With that sort of positive praise, you may wonder why this video is titled the way that it is. And the primary reason for that is due to the idea of cultural osmosis. At the time that it was released, and at the time the movie was made, Stephen King's The Shining was such an original concept done in a very powerful an original way, it felt fresh. It was amazing. It was powerful. It was new. It was creepy. It dealt with really interesting themes and expounded upon them in a way that was very, very special for its time. You might say that Stephen King's The Shining was in some ways, to some authors, and Stanley Kubrick's movie version were so influential that they defined a new type of genre. They inspired a whole new branch of storytelling and types of stories to be told, and then the ways to tell them. They influenced so many horror stories that came after them, and therein lies the problem. Aside from King's actual writing, which I think is still very unique and good, reading through The Shining in the modern context doesn't actually feel all that special. You see, with any work that is so influential and so powerful that it becomes the inspiration for work for decades to come, you start to see pieces of that original work, the best pieces of that original thing become adapted, and I don't mean like just the movie, but like the pieces of these things become adapted and incorporated into many other people's stories. On one level, this power of influence makes this piece of art a classic. It makes it this amazing thing to look up to and to aspire to. And if you're looking at things from a historical sense, you can look at modern horror and trace back the ways that it alludes to these original powerful works, and then the ways that it sort of flips things on their head to play against those same types of ideas. But if you are not a student of history and you don't care about that aspect, and you are someone who picks up The Shining in 2022 or potentially in the future as well, I would say that there is an extreme possibility that due to the idea of cultural osmosis and the fact that this idea has been incorporated into so many other elements of other stories, it actually doesn't feel all that original or special without the understanding of its historical context. Not completely. Obviously, King's writing is good and he does a good job at executing the ideas that he's dealing with, but also so have many other horror works that have been written since the original Shining book. The ideas of alcoholism and abuse and addiction and the way that they play into other horror books that have been written since The Shining is relatively common at this point. The idea of haunted locations being a sort of dark mirror version of seeing the darkness inside ourselves is a very common theme within horror. Heck, it's also a very common theme outside of horror in many instances. And due to the fact that new people are being born every single day and new people are starting to embrace fiction or horror every single day, and their starting point is going to be the now instead of looking everything in its historical context, it creates this weird paradigm where someone might pick up one of these legendary classic instances of something done amazingly well in a way that was so impactful that it changes the landscape of everything to come, and it makes them seem less original when looking at them with fresh eyes. This is the paradigm of originality and cultural osmosis. It is possible for some works of art to become so big and so influential that they take over an entire sphere of influence inside of art, and the piece of work that you created is only important and powerful in almost a historical or academic sense. By the way that everything is inspired by the things that came before it, it's possible that 30, 40 years down the road, your massively successful, innovative book feels pretty run-of-the-mill. This is always a controversial topic to bring up, but if you take an average 16-year-old and you take them away from the influence of wanting to like the things that everybody else likes because they're told it's important, and they've experienced all of the hero's journey stories that they could possibly have experienced in the modern context, and then they're told to watch Star Wars Episode 4, does that movie seem all that special unless they're specifically told, oh, for the time this was amazing, oh, for the time this was incredible, oh, these characters were so different and sci-fi wasn't allowed to be mainstream back then? Or does it just kind of feel like, oh, that was kind of a weird old sci-fi movie? I tend to think the latter, and I've seen it in my own personal anecdotal experience. It seems entirely within the realm of possibility that something can be so powerful and impactful and influential that later on it no longer is all that special. Obviously, this is in a very nuanced sense. It is special because it's the thing that inspired those things, but it no longer feels fresh to fresh eyes in the modern audience when when they're experiencing something that cribs so heavily in their brain from something modern that they like, even if the thing that they like may never have existed without that original work. It's a weird paradox. And this is ultimately why when I originally read The Shining by Stephen King, I obviously loved the writing and I loved the execution of what was being done, but it did not have the original impact the reading might have had if I had nostalgia for it, or if I hadn't read many other horror type scenarios, stories, movies, video games that were heavily inspired by that thing. So when I read Stephen King's The Shining, while I enjoyed it and I loved aspects of it, in a lot of ways, the plot itself, the horror twists and turns themselves, they almost felt generic. And that ultimately is the problem with experiencing The Shining in 2022. And that's the problem with making something that's too good or too popular and then looking at that in hindsight 30, 40 years down the road. Does what I said in this video check with any of you all? Does it make sense? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Let's discuss in the comments down below. Or also, I have a Discord linked down below where we could talk about this concept in depth if you want to. If you'd like to see more videos from me talking about books or artistic culture or storytelling or whatever, please consider subscribing to the channel. If you like the video, give it a thumbs up. And if you think it's a relevant topic that would be interesting to discuss with other people, you could also just share the video with them as well. We're a real grassroots marketing thing around here. The YouTube algorithm is unreliable at best. I'm the type of person that likes to overanalyze and overthink everything when it comes to the idea of what is popular and what is in the zeitgeist. And I'd love it if you'd like to do that with me. But I can't tell you what to do because I'm not your dad. But I am your best friend. Thank you for watching.
No one ever get enough. Always looking out tired, sleep. No one ever get enough. If I don't show up, I might get fired. Sleep. No one ever get enough. Always looking out tired, sleep. No one ever get enough. If I don't show up, I might get fired.